And now to another story, the situation unfolding in Afghanistan. The country could be facing, in addition to everything else, a potential economic collapse in the midst of political turmoil. The International Monetary Fund reports the Afghan central bank held $9.4 billion in reserve assets in April. But as the Taliban took control of the country, the Biden administration froze the portion of that money that's being held in American banks. Meanwhile, international organizations are halting aid money to the country. I want to bring in Will Wexler now. He's the director of the Atlantic Council's Middle East programs and former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Special Operations and Combating Terrorism. Good morning. Could you give us some insight on why the Biden administration felt it was important to freeze this money?
Sure. Well, the Taliban has a long record of supporting terrorism, of doing terrible things against human rights to the people under their control. That's when the last time they were in power in the 1990s, they were heavily sanctioned. I would expect that that same scenario to develop in the future. Right now, what the Biden administration is trying to do is to maximize the leverage that it has over the Taliban, as it has to resort to negotiating with the Taliban in order to get the people out that we want to get out.
Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but it's not that hard for the U.S. to freeze this money because it already has sanctions in place against the Taliban. But can you talk me through what the problem of continued sanctions, long-term sanctions, can be? Things we've seen in places like Iran, other places the U.S. has had sanctions for years and years. Sometimes the government suffers, but sometimes it's the population that ends up bearing the brunt of it. Is that a potential risk in Afghanistan?
Well, that absolutely will be part of the outcome. There's no question. What I anticipate is that a great number of sanctions will come on, and that will be on top of the fact that the economy will collapse even without the sanctions, because the economy in Afghanistan, especially for the about quarter of the people in Afghanistan who live in big cities like Kabul, was almost entirely dependent on outside support. All of that outside support will be going away. The lights will probably be going off. The economy that's built on that support will collapse. So for the average Afghan who lives in a city especially, life is going to be very hard going forward just purely from the absence of support. On top of the absence of support, you get to the sanctions that are going to take place. Life is going to be very difficult, undoubtedly, for the average Afghan. And I think that's a fairly easy prediction to make, unfortunately.
Is there a chance that the U.S. can get what it needs to, get anything out of the Taliban in order to release some of this money? Do you think the Taliban will get access to any of it? And will it make a difference at the end of the day, or will they just keep it for themselves?
You know, the point of having leverage is to use it. And so if there is leverage about holding off IMF funds, holding off other assistance funds, about imposing sanctions so they can be released, I could imagine scenarios in which some elements of it are released. For instance, it's not likely that the Taliban, on the basis of the economy that they're going to have left, will be able to manage a functioning airport and air traffic control and the electricity and everything you need. The international community wants that airport to be open for no other reason than we want the people to continue to get out, if at all possible. So will there be continued assistance down the road to keep the airport open, perhaps from the European Union or Japan or Turkey? I can imagine that kind of support going forward, but it will be all part of a series of negotiations with the Taliban to see if our continued interests can be met. And that right now is an open question.
Right, and the Taliban wants a functioning airport as well, partially for those economic reasons you've been mentioning. What does yesterday's attack signal? How does that change the calculation on this, both from a counterterrorism front, but also from sanctions, from humanitarian aid, for where any of this goes going forward, especially on the financial side?
Well, it's impossible to imagine sanctions ever being removed, or at least, or not as imposed as strictly as one could imagine, if there's an active terrorist threat against the rest of the world, especially against American interests, that emanates from Afghanistan. That's what we saw the last time that the Taliban was in power. The Taliban is deeply connected with Al Qaeda, with the Haqqani network. The Al Qaeda especially will undoubtedly try to do external attacks. The Taliban is an adversary of the Islamic State's local affiliate, but what we saw is that it's unlikely that the Taliban will have the capacity to fully eradicate the Islamic State, and it's also likely that the Islamic State will want to do external attacks. So that will be a key measure of success for the Taliban, to see if they want to get back into the good graces of the rest of the world, is how much they can control these terrorist groups. I, for one, am skeptical of depending on the Taliban to this degree. So which leads us to the need to develop what President Biden called that over-the-horizon counterterrorism capacity, which is a hard thing to do.
I think you're not alone in that skepticism. Will Wexler, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.